You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Dana Peterson, leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board, and guest host of today's episode. Joining me today is Alan Lee, associate economist at the Conference Board. In today's conversation, we will discuss the latest U.S. Consumer Confidence Index, as well as the Q3 real GDP report out of the U.S. Welcome, Alan.
Hello.
It's so great to have you. So, were U.S. consumers more or less confident in December?
Dana, U.S. consumers were indeed a little less confident in December, ending the year on a somewhat cautious note, which we'll see in the details shortly.
So, did this match the trend over the last few months?
I think you're onto something there, Dana. Overall confidence has declined somewhat steadily for the past 5 consecutive months. And if we look at the story for the year, confidence has been trending downward for much of it. I just want to expand in 2025. We had only 2 months where confidence gained in May, where it jumped over 12 points to mark a recovery after tariff negotiations in April, and a 3.5% gain in July, where we had solid Q2 GDP numbers and the stock market was still making all-time highs. Those are the 2 months where it increased, but most of them were declines, moderate declines.
Yeah, that's definitely been the story for the year. Was there an improvement in confidence after the federal government shutdown ended?
Yes. In fact, that's quite interesting. Yes, there was. And that's a great question because it was a volatile month in November where we initially reported a larger drop based on data mostly collected in the first half of the month during the shutdown. But responses in the second half of November were much better after the shutdown ended, which led to a smaller revised drop for November, though still down from October. And in 2025, we had two volatile months like this. Another one, which is April in recent memory, when confidence plummeted in the early half of April, and we cited a big drop from tariff uncertainty, only to recover in the latter half from the pause in tariffs and negotiations. But there was an improvement after the November's federal government shutdown.
Thank you. So, 2 out of the last 12 months were disrupted by policy. So, let's dive into the details of the report. Were there any notable differences in confidence by demographic group? Let's start with age.
Okay, so on age, yeah, we like to look at trends in both the monthly and the 6-month moving averages to avoid some of the noise in the data and also to get more color on trends. So confidence was slightly down across all age groups in December on a 6-month moving average basis, more so for younger folks than older. But however, consumers under 35 are still by far the more confident than those over 35.
And what about income?
By income, confidence was indeed also weak across the board on a month-to-month and 6-month basis. And by confidence level, consumers earning less are less confident, while some groups are in slightly negative territory. Meanwhile, some higher income groups are still slightly positive level-wise.
That makes sense. The Conference Board has some brand new data. 2 sets are generations and also political affiliation. So let's first talk about generations. Was there anything notable in that data in terms of trends?
Generations are interesting. They tell even more of a story beyond just the age groups we cover. So by level, Gen Z are the most confident because while that they're the youngest generation that we report in the survey, baby boomers and Gen X are the least confident. Millennials and silent generation are in the middle, possibly for different reasons that could be interesting to examine.
Wow, that's super interesting. It's good news that young people are still optimistic. But certainly by political affiliation, which is something that we've been sharing, was there anything notable about confidence by political affiliation?
In the month, confidence slipped again for all political affiliations in December. Moreover, for in 2025, Republicans hold by far the greatest confidence. Democrats are much less confident, and independents are somewhat higher than Democrats, which makes sense to me.
Okay, but in general, everyone was feeling a little less optimistic in December.
Right.
So let's move on. What are consumers saying about the present situation?
Yes, as it stands in December, consumer assessments of the present situation remains positive, but significantly less so than when they started the year. There's two measures in this, and of the two measures in the present situation, current business conditions notably slipped into negative territory this month, with those saying conditions are bad edging out those saying conditions are good, but just slightly. Consumers' rating of the labor market is still holding up for now, even though it's gradually softening in the month. And this, what I see is it's tracking the unemployment rate and the overall labor market in general. Consumers are finding it harder to find jobs right now.
Yes, that's certainly being borne out in the data. What are consumers expecting 6 months in the future? Is that better than what they're thinking about now?
Yeah, Dana, I think expectations for 6 months ahead are far more hesitant. The number is below 80 for many months. It's right now at 70.7, while expected business conditions and jobs are in negative territory, and consumers still expect their own household incomes to be slightly more, but it's very close to zero. So it quite a bit more negative than the present situation.
Wow, and a number below 80, what does that typically signal?
So we see that when it persistently stays at a number below 80, it's typically associated with rising risks of recession.
So are consumers believing that there's a recession coming?
Mostly consumers still think recession is somewhat likely, which rose a little bit in December. Overall movement is still relatively flat. It hasn't gone vertical yet, but just a little bit elevated as of December.
Yes, I think also there was a little bit of an up creep in those who believe we're in recession right now, but that's a super small percentage. So let's move on to inflation expectations. Have they changed at all?
Inflation expectations have come down slightly, but they still remain elevated from what I see.
And what about the stock market or even interest rates? Just rounding
So
out the different financial aspects.
sure, we got a rate cut in December. Those expecting somewhat higher interest rates are still elevated. So consumers still do feel that interest rates are high, and separately though, they still expect stock prices to increase in the next year.
Okay, so it all depends on your portfolio. So let's talk about the write-ins. So consumers were still citing inflation, politics, and tariffs as having an effect on the economy in general, not specifically positively or negatively. Was that still the case?
Oh yeah, we have a quite an interesting question where we have consumers write in what they think. And so prices and inflation are back to the top cited keywords in this write-in, but mentions of politics and tariffs eased after the government shutdown ended, mostly getting taken over by talks about high prices and inflation.
And were there any other write-ins that were notable in the month?
Sure, to a lesser extent, geopolitical and societal themes are popping up, and some are talking about financial concerns this month.
Yeah. And so regarding consumers' financial positions, both currently and in the future, what are they saying?
So, interestingly, current financial situation, we asked consumers to rate their total family situation. So that has dipped into slightly negative. So those saying like their current situation is good is slightly being outweighed by those saying current situations are bad. However, looking forward, they still feel that their situations will improve.
That's good.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to summer of 2026. Finally, let's talk a little bit about buying plans. Let's start off with goods. Were there any notable trends in buying plans for big ticket items?
Yeah, so we asked consumers if they plan to buy any big ticket items within 6 months, and most household appliances are down a bit, but some parts that consumers think will buy more are smartphones, tablets, and digital cameras, which have trended up on a 6 month basis.
So again, consumers are expecting interest rates to be higher 6 months from now. We're not sure which interest rates they're talking about, but certainly interest rates impact housing and autos. What were their perceptions on purchasing homes and buying cars?
Yeah, so we did see a dip on both of those. So housing and cars have dipped, but consumers also their purchasing plans of used cars actually have are going up still, whereas their plans for new cars are down.
That makes absolute sense since new cars are so expensive and even used cars are getting more expensive. Let's take a look at services. Are there any notable trends there?
Yeah, for the past 6 or 7 months, the top categories that we're seeing are still restaurants, bars, takeout, streaming, internet, mobile services, beauty and personal care, utilities, and healthcare. But by contrast, travel plans and travel services like hotels and airfare have stepped down with the latest readings.
Also, do you notice any shifts over the last year and what consumers are buying?
I would say they're they're buying more, they're looking to stay home more and they're buying more affordable things. I would say it's shifted towards that a little bit.
Okay. That was an excellent overview of what consumers are feeling right now and also what they're anticipating for next year. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of our conversation.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate the future of AI? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, governance and sustainability, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. Again, I'm Dana Peterson, leader of the Economy Strategy and Finance Center at the Conference Board. I'm also, again, joined by Alan Lee, Associate Economist at the Conference Board. We are actually going to turn the tables, and Alan will ask me questions about the U.S. economy. Alan?
Great. I was looking forward to this part. Dana, let's switch gears and talk about the Q3 US GDP release. The economy grew by a surprising 4.3% quarter, while while annual rate, while the consensus was a full 1% lower. So what drove the outside reading? Maybe let's start with consumption, Dana. Let's start with that.
Sure, absolutely. Even though we had data for real consumption for July, August, and September, it was still much larger than expected. So potentially after the government shutdown, the Bureau of Economic Analysis was able to collect even more data. And so while most were anticipating consumption to be around 2.5, 2.75%, or even close to 3, consumption was even higher than that ultimately when it was released. And so we saw very strong spending, yes, for goods, but more so for services. And as you mentioned, people are shifting away from expensive things, and certainly consumers are shifting towards a lot of services over goods, which are more subject to tariffs. So we did see some strong consumer spending there. But I would note that looking at services, which were very strong, A big chunk of it was spending on healthcare, which is fascinating. We don't really know why. That's something we certainly need to watch. The fact that so much of the spending that occurred was on people taking care of their health.
Sure, that is also in the top five of our services spending in the CCI, so it aligns.
Yes.
Um, can I move on to how about investment then? More like business and residential investment.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start with residential investment. That continued to be very negative in terms of growth, and it has been because of affordability issues regarding housing. Even though mortgage rates have fallen over the course of this year, prices of homes are still very expensive. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the market is still not clearing, where mortgage rates are not low enough for many people to sell their homes and buy a new one. So if you have a 2.5% mortgage rate, you don't really want to sell your home and then have to take on one that's 5 or 6 or 7%. And so that's making the inventory of housing very limited. And so that's keeping prices elevated. So until we see not only mortgage rates come off, but also home prices not rise as quickly, we're still going to continue to see weak residential investment, not only in this year, but also for next year. When it comes to business investment, we continue to see strong investments in equipment, especially computing, as well as intellectual property. But those growth rates were in some cases almost half of what we saw in the second quarter, so not as robust. And also, business expenditures on other types of equipment and residential investment were weak. A non-residential investment was weak, and non-residential investment spending is probably going to continue to fall because you have less income from the government or less money from the government from the industrial policies that supported tons of investment in onshoring and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Dana. So, what do you see in government spending?
Government spending actually was a positive contributor in the third quarter after being a negative contributor in the first half of the year. And even that first half weakness was surprising given the fact that over the last 2 or 3 years, industrial policies had been boosting government investment, especially at the federal government level. So it was nice to see a little bit of a rebound in government spending, especially at the federal level. Again, it was the end of the fiscal year. Q3 is the final quarter in the government's fiscal year. So there could have been some catch-up spending before the money goes away. But nonetheless, it was still good to see that little bit of a bump.
Okay, how about international trade?
Sure. Regarding international trade and inventories, we only had 2 out of 3 months of data. And that's because just in general, trade and inventories data tend to lag by 2 months. But also with the government shutdown, it took longer to collect and verify and then distribute the data. But exports were actually quite strong, and imports actually were lower. I believe they fell in the quarter. But we have a little bit of concern about the inventories. As I mentioned earlier, consumer spending was healthy for goods, which are the things that are usually imported, and more so outweigh the services that we export. And so net exports were actually a positive contributor to growth. But as I mentioned earlier, consumption was strong and imports fell, but inventories didn't really collapse, which those two other events would have suggested. So we're just curious about some of these data and whether or not with revisions we'll see different numbers, or even with the September data, that there could be some changes both in international trade and also in inventories.
How about domestic demand? Do you see any other trends in there?
Domestic demand, which is basically all the things that consumers, businesses, and governments are consuming, excluding also imports, which are things that US consumers and businesses are buying from abroad, that data was actually pretty strong. The growth rate picked up to around 2.9%. And that's good news. But again, we're still curious about that consumer spending data. And we're hoping that, yes, that all these data are as good as they sound and that we won't have any revisions later. But again, that remains to be seen. But domestic demand was healthy in the quarter.
Okay. Out of the forecasted numbers, only 1 out of 62 professional forecasters surveyed by a business media outlet was even close to the actual. That's unusual. So do you think the government shutdown affected the report in any way?
We can't say for certain right now, but we can say that, yes, some of the data were delayed and there were issues in terms of collecting all the data. And we also know that some of the government agencies are a little bit smaller in staff, so that could also potentially affect the speed at which surveys can be collected and the data put together and then distributed. So we didn't have all the data, and indeed there were some inputs that were actually not collected during the shutdown because it was just not possible to do. So there is some missing data. So again, we don't know how much the government shutdown affected the report, but it is possible. And I think that's something that we definitely need to look at more data, especially the first and the only revision to the GDP data, which we'll get in January. Usually we have an advanced release and then two revisions in the two subsequent months. But this time we're only going to have this advanced release and then a final release in January.
Okay. Is there any additional evidence in the data, you would say?
Yeah, again, the curiosities in terms of the big change in consumption relative to what the BE published initially for July, August, and September, and what was published today. So it's possible that they just got a lot more data between the end of the shutdown and now that allowed them to post a different number that was actually much improved than what we were expecting. And again, with the inventories, the math just doesn't seem to add up. Inventories, we believe, should have been a lot weaker. But again, we didn't have all the data, and we need to see what things look like once it all comes out.
Okay. So let's shift gears. What do you think Q4 might look like?
It we don't have a ton of data for the fourth quarter either. Again, because some of it was delayed by the federal government shutdown, which was, mind you, one of the longest, maybe the longest ever. The data we do have is that real disposable personal income in the third quarter slowed, both on a year and on a quarterly annualized basis. So, yes, that's the third quarter, but on an annualized basis, it was 0%. So, that's pretty bad. There was no change in real disposable income. And disposable income is just all sources of income less taxes, so taking away taxes, so after tax income. And typically that portends whether or not consumers are going to spend. And indeed, as you mentioned in our consumer confidence measure, although it looks out 6 months from now, sometimes what consumers are saying they're expecting 6 months from now reflect a little bit of what's going on in their everyday lives. And let's not also forget that tariffs were repeatedly delayed over the course of this year. So we still think that there could be a further upcreep in underlying inflation, especially for goods. And that could potentially spill over to businesses becoming more cautious because they see less spending and letting people go. And that just speaks to also, we do have the November unemployment rate, which rose from 4.4% in September to 4.6% in November. Now, again, there could have been some disruptions there that caused the unemployment rate to be higher. Number one, you had over 100,000 federal government workers retiring as they were offered a package to retire earlier this year. And those retirements happened and hit the November number. Also, you had a number of people who were on furlough. And when you're furloughed, you're more or less considered not to be employed. So we could see a reversal in the unemployment rate for December. But again, we don't know. And overall, looking at the inflation, path, the personal income path, as well as the fact that while companies are not letting people go en masse, they're also not hiring people. And so we're seeing some increasing risks to the labor market. So, with all that, I think that we still need to watch the data, and we're not ready to quite augment the fourth quarter because we don't have key inputs right now. But we
Mm,
do think that we will see slower growth in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of 2026. But then once we get to the middle of the year, things will pick up and we'll probably be in a low to mid 2% range by the end of next year.
wow, I'll certainly be looking for advanced clues in our consumer survey as well. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, finally, then how might you think the Federal Reserve might react to the GDP report?
I don't think the Federal Reserve Board can deny all aspects of this report. I think there were certainly behaviors that were consistent with what we thought in the actual GDP data. And also, consumer spending probably was more robust than anticipated. Nonetheless, policy officials have warned that they are going to be looking at these data closely and potentially with somewhat of a skeptical eye, just given the fact that there were a lot of difficulties in collecting, producing, seasonally adjusting, all those things about the data during the federal government shutdown. And they may want to see a little bit more information before they make any decisions in January. Nonetheless, I think that their bigger focus is on the labor market. And if we continue to see weak readings for key elements of the labor market, and also a big thing for them is continued wage slowing, which also appeared in today's GDP report in terms of personal income, that they may still consider cutting rates in January. But again, all that remains up in the air at this point.
Wow, that was very informative. Thanks for being here with me today, Dana.
Absolutely, Alan. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Alan Lee, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.